Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and today I wanted to go over my initial Stamina Templar testing on the PTS, and take a look at how it's looking for the Flames of Ambition DLC. So I'll just go through all of the stuff I think is important or interesting or changing up this patch, showcase the build, and then we'll end with the parse on the trial dummy. So first off, with the racial reworks, it does look like Dunmer and Khajiit are neck and neck for the best option now for stamina DPS, with Dunmer's just barely squeaking out ahead. I did these calculations on UESP's build editor, using the build that I found to do best: Reliquin, Deadly Strike, 2 one-piece crits for the monster pieces, and Maelstrom Bow on the backbar. With Orcs losing 1,000 stamina this patch, the only real advantage they have over Dunmer now is their max health line. However, Khajiits also get nearly as much health as Orcs with 915 instead of 1,000, and seem to be almost even with Dunmer's for damage as well. So all in all, the top 3 options are all within less than 1% difference, and the difference going from the worst to the best racial option is much smaller now than it has been before. Interesting too that High Elf moved up to 4th now after getting 258 weapon damage added to their racial kit. A few notes about the testing here. The Thief Mundus appears to be a little better than the Shadow now, unless you're using a crit set like Berserking Warrior, and even then they seem to be pretty close to even. And at just 1 stack of Simmering Frenzy, Khajiit does pass up Dark Elf for damage. The Khajiit crit damage passive does boost enchantment damage as well, which is something that none of the other races' passives will boost. Khajiit also has more health and better sustain than Dark Elf, and will pass Dark Elf when the 15% crit damage flanking CP passive can't be used. Overall, I don't think they've struck a perfect balance here, but I am happy that the racial choices do matter a little bit less in Flames of Ambition, and the power difference has been squashed down a bit. I'll touch on the Thief versus the Shadow again real quick. It does seem like they are really close in most setups. I found the Thief to be better with Templar when running Reliquin, Deadly Strike, or the new Kinra's set, and then the Shadow to do pretty close to the same as the Thief when running Berserking Warrior. Either way, they are both pretty close, but I think Thief will win out in most setups. So as far as the top gear sets, I just mentioned a lot of them. The actual order I would put them in from best to worst for damage, paired with Reliquin, is Deadly Strike, followed by Kinra's, and then Berserking Warrior. Interesting though, when finding a Reliquin replacement to pair with Deadly Strike, for fights where Reliquin is not best, I found the order to slightly change, and Berserking Warrior performed the best for me, followed closely by Kinra's, and then Leviathan, and then Dagon's Dominion, Yondir's Might, and Zogben all seemed really close together just behind Leviathan there. I think maybe the reason that Kinra's passes up Berserking Warrior whenever it's paired with Reliquin is because the major Berserk it gives does boost that Reliquin damage, while none of the Berserking Warrior bonuses boost the Reliquin damage, since Reliquin can't crit. However, Deadly Strike does still boost Reliquin the best with the 20% increase. Alright, so going Bloodthirsty versus Infused. I got the best results in my testing with Bloodthirsty, but it is pretty close. I don't think much has changed here from my previous conclusions, so if you're running with a lot of classes like Necromancers and Nightblades whose damage really ramps up in Execute and makes it go fast, Infused might show you slightly better results for you to push the front end of the fight a little faster, but otherwise I think Bloodthirsty is generally the better option in most scenarios. Definitely comes out a little bit ahead testing solo. So let's touch on the weapons rework a little bit. They reworked Twin Blade and Blunt so that it now grants the following bonuses. Axes now increase your crit damage and healing done by 4% per axe rather than having a chance to apply a bleed. Maces now grant 1650 armor pen per mace rather than ignoring 10% of the target's physical resistance. Swords now grant weapon and spell damage per sword rather than increasing damage done. And then daggers now grant 3.7% crit chance per dagger rather than 5% weapon critical chance. So I'd rank the weapons in this order now for usefulness: daggers, then swords, then maces, and then axes. Swords and maces could probably flip-flop there depending on what you're doing and what you need exactly. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. That's just probably the order of how often I will use these weapons. So the 8% crit damage from a couple of axes really can't compete with the 7.2% crit chance from daggers, nor the 284 weapon damage from swords. Maces can be nice now if you need the extra penetration, but I don't see a scenario where you'd want to run axes now, not on Templar at least. One interesting thing is that a sharpened dagger compared to a precise mace offers almost identical stats. So if you happen to find a mace instead of a dagger, it can definitely be a good option. Swords still don't appear to be able to quite hang with daggers, but should be really nice paired with mechanical acuity for trash setups, as even at 100% crit chance, they still hit a little harder than axes do. So let's look at the different weapon sets we can run. So not a lot has really changed here. The Maelstrom bow still outperforms Black Rose Prison dual wield by just a smidge, maybe 1 to 2k DPS tops. The reason is the longer timer on Endless Hail over Deadly Cloak allows us to spend a lot more time using jabs, and Endless Hail also does a good amount more damage than Deadly Cloak does. I tried using the Quick Cloak morph as well, and while it's not terrible, since it does keep the buff up longer, the damage from Quick Cloak is pretty pitiful at only like 2k DPS, so it really isn't worth it. One positive for Black Rose dual wield though is it does mean casting Deadly Cloak, which gives you major evasion, plus another 6% damage reduction on top of that from the actual set. So with the damage difference being really small like it is, it might be worth it to you to run it for the extra tankiness, depending on what you're working on. I did also mess around with a Maelstrom Inferno staff a little bit, and it actually still gets pretty good results. I used Destra ults here for fun, and it wasn't too far behind the more traditional setups. For our front bar arena sets, you do have to drop a monster set, and then you have the option of going Black Rose dual wield, Masters dual wield, or Vatashran dual wield. The main problem with these sets here is that you have certain skills that you have to cast that aren't jabs. So they are all still performing really well and only like 2 to 3k DPS behind just using a monster set. So if you really like the theme of them or want something specific from one of them, they aren't bad options. I just couldn't squeak out quite as much damage with them compared to just front barring Deadly Strike with a monster set. So about the monster sets, I did mention earlier I was using 2 one-piece crits. Slime kra'gh and Grundwolf are the best options as they'll give you both physical and spell crit, and Slime kra'gh has a slightly higher bonus on it as well. I also tried Selene and Doma House, and unfortunately both seemed a little bit worse. Selene took a little bit of a hit this patch and was only doing a little over 2k DPS for me. Doma House seemed pretty solid and was close in damage, so I think in fights like the dragons in Sunspire where the ring from Doma House will also hit, it should likely beat out the 2 one-piece crits. And bash weaving for Marsalok with biting jabs as your spamble is a bit difficult, and sustain is too hard on the trial dummy to test it out, but should be a decent option in trials still if you can sustain it and you are comfortable weaving it with your jabs. One thing that I found really interesting is that DPS without any champion points is much higher now than it was previously. So with the top end DPS coming down a bit, the gap between having CP and not having it is much smaller. For example, on the live servers with no CP on a Templar, I'm like 55 to 60k DPS, and on live with CP, I hit 113k DPS. And then on the PTS, with no CP, I am now at 80k DPS, and then with CP, I'm at 104k. So you can see that champion points overall add a lot less to our DPS than they did previously. Also did a parse at 810 CP just to see how close it was to max damage, and as I expected, we are most of the way there. At a little over 96k, I was only about 8% away from topping out. Alright, now I'll go through the skills I was running in my 104k parse. Starting out, we have a couple of Fighter's Guild abilities that are just here for the passives. We're not actually casting them. So we have Camouflaged Hunter and Ring of Preservation. And then we have Barbed Trap, which we are casting. And then Biting Jabs and Hircine's Rage and Flawless Dawnbreaker for our ultimate. For the backbar, we have Camouflaged Hunter again, Endless Hail, Ritual of Retribution, Radiant Ward, Hircine's Rage, and the ultimate Shooting Star. Radiant Ward can be any skill from the Adric Spear skill line. It's just there for a passive 10% crit damage boost. Since Templar has so many flex spots that we're usually just slotting Fighters Guild abilities in, one interesting thing that I was doing here is double barring both Camo Hunter for the Major Savagery and Hircine's Rage, the Werewolf ability, for Major Brutality. You can't actually cast this ability outside of Werewolf form, but you can still get the passive from slotting it. So what this does is allow us to run Heroism pots instead of the standard pots and get our ultimate back a little bit more quickly. So if you can have a tank run Igneous Weapons instead, which gives you Major Brutality also, slotting 2 more Fighters Guild abilities instead of the Werewolf abilities here is a little bit more damage since it'll boost another 3% weapon damage, but for a solo setup, having the Werewolf ability there works pretty well. It would also let you run trash pots like in dungeons or something, and you'd still get all your buffs. So Ritual was already really good as an AoE ability, but now it's worth casting for single target damage as well. The new CP system boosts both physical and magical damage equally instead of you speccing into one or the other. So this really benefits abilities like Ritual that scale with your highest stats a lot in comparison to their previous performance. Plus it costs magicka to cast, so it's really nice tool for sustaining a rotation as well. So Shooting Star is a new addition here as well. For the same reasons mentioned for Ritual, it has improved in the amount of DPS it provides and seems to do a bit better than just casting Dawnbreakers or Ballistas. Those ultimates aren't bad if you really don't want to do the Mages Guild grind, but Shooting Star does seem to squeak out ahead by a couple thousand DPS. Dawnbreaker's still great to have on the front bar too, because not only does it give you the weapon damage passive, if you find you aren't going to get enough ultimate for a Shooting Star, it is a good bit cheaper, so you can use that one instead, just depending on your situation. So you'll see we aren't slotting Power of the Light. It is a nice debuff if your group needs it, but with so many more ways to access Minor Breach now, it's likely your group already has it covered in some other way. So one cast of Biting Jabs simply does more damage than one cast of Power of the Light. So DPS is higher without it, especially since we can have a Fighter's Guild ability here boosting our weapon damage instead. If Sustain is rough for you, adding Power of the Light is a nice tool to help, as it costs about 500 less stamina than Jabs, so you can save a little bit of resources each time you cast it. A couple of other really good abilities to slot, which I couldn't fit on my backbar here using Heroism Pots, are Restoring Focus and Repentance. Both add a nice bit of sustain, with Repentance being an obscene amount of sustain when there are a lot of enemies dying. Restoring Focus not only adds sustain, but also makes you really tanky as well, adding almost 6k resists or nearly 9k if you're standing inside the room. Alright, so now I'll go through the rotation. We open up with Hail, we bar swap to Barbed Trap, bar swap Shooting Star, and then we'll start our light attack weaving with Ritual, and then bar swap and start jabbing. Then the remaining rotation will just be Hail and Ritual paired together on your back bar and jabbing on your front bar until you have 1 second left on Hail. So how many jabs you can fit here will depend on how fast you're weaving, but you want to be as close to 1 set of jabs per second as possible. I usually get 9 or 10 casts off before I swap. And then you'll replace one of your jabs with a Barbed Trap whenever it's about to run out, or with your ultimate whenever that's ready. And then if you are using a different backbar other than a bow, you'll just replace Endless Hail with whatever that weapon's ability is. So Deadly Cloak with dual wield, Stampede with a two-hander, or Elemental Blockade if you're using a staff. Here's the gear I used. Like I said before, a sharp dagger or a precise mace offers pretty much the same stat, so you can go with either there. I did find a flame and a poison glyph to do a little better than crafted poisons on the front bar. The glyph damage plus the status effects for them does seem to do about 1k or so DPS higher. If you are running Black Rose dual wield, you could actually run these glyphs on the back bar and then still use poisons on the front bar. Now I'll go through the CP I'm using. The 4 slottables are Backstabber, 15% crit damage while flanking, Fighting Finesse, 10% crit damage, Thaumaturge, 10% damage over time, and Biting Aura, 10% AoE damage. I like the AoE one here better than the single target one since it does boost our jabs damage. And for a full CP leveling guide, make sure to check out my champion points video. There are a few different options for leveling, and you'll just replace the 4 slottables with the ones I just gave. I'll have that video linked down in the description, and in the description of that video are also all the CP charts as well, so if you don't really want to watch through all of it, you can just grab the info there. And then finally, I wanted to give a shout out to Johnson Jamie. He's been subbed to my Twitch page since the first day I could accept subs, and we are 1 month out from it being a whole year now at this point. I really appreciate the support, man. Well, that will do it for this one. Not quite a full build video, more just an update and discussion about the changes from the previous build, but I hope it helps you to get the most out of your Templar for this coming patch. I'll let the Parse play out from here. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.
leaders and the